Hey everybody, this is Brent and you are listening to the Speaking of podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Laurel Buckingham, and we're speaking of a bunch of different things. Mainly, I just kind of geek out here and just ask him questions about life and ministry and leadership. He's one of my heroes, and I've been trying to sit down with some of my heroes, and he definitely is one of my all-time just role models in life and ministry, and it's just a real treat to sit down with him today. Here's my conversation with Dr. Laurel Buckingham. We're live.
Hey,
just like that.
Good to be here.
I am here with Dr. Laurel Buckingham, LDB, as we call him. Dr. B. I have been on this little podcast experiment of mine. One of the things I've done is wanting to sit down with some heroes and some people that have inspired me as not just a leader, but that's obviously part of it, but as an individual, as a pastor, as a human being. And so I've had Dr. H.C. Wilson and Pastor John Simons and you, and actually at some point I'd like to get the three of you at the table at the same time and just lob you guys some questions and hear some more stories.
Yeah.
So that's
it's interesting because we've had our picture taken, the three of us together, and been in situations together, and it's been pretty dynamic.
Yeah, well, you guys, all three of you have meant so much to me in similar and in different ways, and so it's I really appreciate that you come and sit down.
Well, I'm just so glad to hear you say that I'm different from either one of those guys, so that makes me feel better.
I bet you they'd say the same thing, wouldn't they?
Maybe.
So that's why I need all three of you here, so you can defend yourselves together. We'll line that up, but I wanted to sit down with you one-on-one though in this format, and I've had the privilege over the last few years of getting to know you and getting to benefit from building a relationship with you. But I've actually never heard the Dr. Buckingham story before kind of Moncton Wesleyan and
Right.
as you led there for decades, and
Yep.
that's anybody in Atlantic Canada that's listening, that's part of the church knows your name, and they know Moncton Wesleyan as a flagship church. What go back and what got you into pastoral ministry in the first place?
I'm telling you what, I hope I can be succinct, which is not necessarily
the beauty of the podcast is you don't need to be.
All right, I'm glad to hear that. But I was brought up in a very backward denomination. It was called Primitive Baptist.
It was actually called Primitive.
And they were primitive.
Neanderthal.
Now they have amalgamated with a denomination that's fairly large in the United States called Free Will Baptist.
Okay.
But anyway, in those days, but I felt called. I don't know how to describe. Ever since I was a Christian, that I had to someday preach.
Okay.
And yet I felt so stinking inadequate. I mean, I was terrible in school. Spent 4 of the happiest years of my life in grades 9 and 10.
4.
4.
No, kidding.
No kidding. And then I took 2 years in 1 after that when I got my act together a little bit, and I could not even get up in a service and give a testimony. I was so nervous.
Wow.
I couldn't debate or anything. I'd make all kinds of mistakes. I truly had, really and truly, this is no exaggeration, an extreme inferiority complex.
Really?
Probably to the point of almost being a real mental issue. And so I just felt totally inadequate. But I was no good at anything. I was brought up on a farm. I was no good at farming. Broke everything on the farm I ever touched, and just couldn't do anything. I'll be the last one chosen in a softball game because I was not an athlete. So I just had nothing going for me.
Right.
And yet I felt this call, and I felt I had.
No
it was just like there was no option. I had to do it.
You had a sense of that at a pretty young age.
All the way through, it kept intensifying.
Wow.
And I remember one time it was so extreme that I made a guy promise he'd never tell anybody in the world, and I just went through all kinds of contortions to get him to be sure he would never tell anybody. And this was when I was 18 years old.
Okay.
And I told him that I was called to preach. And anyway.
That was the first time you voiced it to someone?
First time I voiced it to anybody.
Wow.
Yeah. I would go to a conference where they had sermons that I would look at, and I would look around like I was looking at pornography or something, not wanting anybody to see that I was
just secret.
Yeah, it was just I felt people would laugh at me.
So what was that process of going from, you knew you had this kind of internal burden and dialogue with God, but miles away from actuating it? What happened?
It was kind of a dramatic thing when in a church service, I I yielded. I just surrendered.
Wow.
And I was even emotionally probably somewhat sick. Everything was bothering me so, and just felt so.
Where was that? Tell me about that service.
I was in the high school department at Bethany Bible College that had a high school department at that time, and they had evangelistic meetings that were going on, and I was totally out of character when I yielded. I just was demonstrative in that yielding. In those days, they had what they call altar service, had people come up and give their testimony and all this, and I was just not myself. I mean, in a positive way, not a negative way. And so that was the end of that, and now it's public, and I had to follow through.
Did things start, like, after? I think I'd love to talk to you about that yieldedness and that surrender piece, because I think that's such a huge component of the life that God has for us. It's like he has these things, but it's not going to come, at the cost of your ability to yield to him as Lord, and there are things where he just says, until you bow the knee, you're not going to access that.
I was set free.
Yeah, like I was going to ask, like what awakened in you? What started happening?
I just became a different personality altogether, just a different person, and it was just liberating. And then a couple of things happened. I was invited to go to another place a long ways away from where Bethany was located at the time, to speak at a youth rally. And honestly, because I'm not very mystical, but I don't know how else to describe this. I'd be the last person in that college. I was now in the college department that should have been asked to represent that school someplace else.
God just made it happen.
In the president's mind, it didn't make any sense whatsoever.
So do you remember that first? First
do
sermon?
I ever?
Do you remember what you preached on?
Yeah. Therefore, being justified by faith, we have peace with God. And I'm telling you what, I sure had the peace. I thought I was Billy Graham after that thing was over with, because I'm sorry, I had no idea you were getting into this kind of thing. Went into the church, and the person that was conducting the youth rally, it was a youth rally, youth weekend, he wanted to know who was speaking that night. And the other guy that was with me said, Laurel Buckingham. And he just looked at me like, like, how could this guy be speaking? Because I looked about 4 or 5 years younger than I really was. And so I looked like a kid. And I was so scared that when we went up to to a room off from the platform, and everybody prayed before we went out on the platform, I couldn't pray.
You were just
tongue-tied. I was tongue-tied. I was just...
And you had to preach.
I had to preach.
Oh, my goodness.
And an older man gets up before I'm to speak, W.L. Fernley, and he said, how many of you would like to help the preacher preach tonight? Well, because I was so inferior and so scared, that was like a great big thing to me, that this man had just given me some great big affirmation and gift, and all of a sudden, I just was set free.
Wow!
And I felt like I was Billy Graham, as I said, and that was the kind of breakthrough.
Well, something kind of came alive
once you just came alive.
You confronted that. It's interesting though. There's probably some legitimate, humility in there in that, and there's some truth in the feeling inferior. There's a real dialogue that happens with God where he's like, no, I'm called. It's like Moses when God called him to deliver.
So many in the Bible.
Yeah.
So
he's
many.
like, who, me?
Yeah.
Gideon, great man of valor. You talking to somebody else?
Didn't make a bit of sense to me whatsoever.
Yeah.
None whatsoever.
Yeah. But then once you kind of faced that, was it kind of after that moment you got a taste and you're like, this is what I was made for?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So what happened? So out of that,
then,
you're in your 20s,
because
I'm
of this primitive Baptist church that I was brought up in, I just felt like they needed help. I should try to help them. And I took 3 of their churches up in the Toby, Plaster Rock, and a place called Arthurette, another place called Lairwick. And they were so backward that they did not believe in paying salaries, because they're just little country churches. Okay. So you had to live by faith. Well, the truth is none of them ever did. And I determined that I was called to preach, and I was going to preach, and I was going to do secular work. Yeah. But you could starve to death, And so it was like the doctrine of the virgin birth, that you were not to be paid a salary. You're to live by faith. Well, but nobody did. So I preached the premise, if we pay a salary, then everybody's going to have to live by faith because you're going to have to faith to meet the salary.
Yeah.
But I knew it never passed in the business meeting, so I just went around to every home and talked to people about, they weren't giving through envelopes or anything like that. And I can't go on and on about this, but there was one church where I would get $5 a Sunday. And now we're talking back in 1961. Mm-hmm. Well, that was all right. But one Sunday I got $8. Will you imagine going from 5 to 8?
Yeah,
I thought I'd died and gone to heaven.
Increase.
I mean, that's a pretty good increase.
You could buy a Big Mac meal with that now.
So anyhow, after we got this thing going, money started coming to this little church, like $40, $50 a week. Well, you just imagine going from $5 a week, $40, $50 a week. So I appointed a finance committee, just arbitrarily appointed a finance committee, and they sat down, decide what they're going to pay me, and decide to pay me $20 a week. Will you imagine going from $5 to $20?
Yeah,
and some of the old saints that were brought up in that live by faith, they said, "Oh, we've never had money in this church ever before, and this is just the greatest thing that's ever happened to us," and da 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 da. And they fought it like tooth and nail when we first started talking about it.
But did fruitfulness start at the flow after they chose to honor the leadership?
They had to exercise some faith.
That's right. Yeah, isn't that such a backwards? I mean, I was thinking
it's unbelievable.
I was watching the American presidential debate there a few weeks ago.
That must have been fun.
It was, and I just sat there and I got thinking, to be fair, like what drives a person to get into politics? There's not a whole lot of incentive to attract the best people. Like the best people are out building companies, and it's like they're gonna have to just start writing huge checks to incentivize, the Jeff Bezoses of the world to come in and make that their career. But it's like in the church, I've thought that for some time. You have an epidemic of leadership, and you have these outliers maybe where God will, call a person like you and just put it so much on their heart that I'm going to give myself to this. And I think there's something to be said.
There's something to be said. And look, you know what I'd like to say, interject here, Brent, is, I wasn't getting hardly enough to live on. And then that all changed. And the next place I took less money. Mm-hmm. My salary doubled within 4 years.
Yeah.
The next place was Moncton. And I was getting less money. I was getting $92 a week for several years. Yep. Now, the money value was different, you got to understand that. And then I might have ended up not being as high paid as you are probably, but I ended up being very well taken care of. But starting out in an environment where you weren't to expect anything financially,
right,
to end up in an environment where I was getting paid more than I was worth.
Yeah, well, I think there's two things that especially in a church, it's complicated because I think there's a dialogue between the pastor and God. I think most pastors at some point have probably turned down more money or taken less money.
And I did.
I
turned down salary raises. Yep.
And that's something because this has to be bigger than if you're going to be a pastor. It has to be bigger than this is just a good career option. You don't get into this
Brent,
for that.
I know that this is. I don't put this on anybody else. What I'm about to say, I really don't. But I have never, ever once even hinted at a raise in salary or increase or anything financially for myself. Yeah. And I think, by the way, one of the worst things in any leader is to have that mentality of I'm forgetting the word, but
kind of selfish focus.
Yeah, looking for what they want,
what I can
themselves.
get. I think if you go like. A pastor shouldn't be a pastor in ministry if it's about what you can get. It's not a good career option. You go make more money doing something else.
But I do believe if you give it your best.
Well, and I would say to a church, and you do a lot of consulting for churches, I would say to them, it's very important that you take very seriously, that you pay your pastors and you pay your staff, because the way that you honor them says something about how you're stewarding.
I agree with that 100%.
It flows, and so.
But here's what I just think is so harmful in any realm is an entitlement mentality.
Totally.
I think that is just
dangerous. Yeah. Dangerous. So you end up you preach the paint off the walls, and that first time I'm impressed. I've blocked my first sermon out of my memory. I don't remember what it was, and I don't want to know. So what happened? I'm assuming throughout you being your 20s, you probably went to some different church opportunities. Probably got married in that time.
Yes, In my first church, after I'd been there for 3 years, I think it was, yes, that's when we were married. I went there in 61, we were married in 63. And then in 65, I was planning to go to a college in southern United States that would have taken me away from here, but somebody tried to steer me in the direction of a place called Monticello, Maine. It was just a little community of 1,100 people. We just saw that thing explode, that church. I knocked on every door in that community more than once. Wow. Of course, that was the way they did it back then. That's not the way that works today, but that worked back then. And I remember when I left there, I don't know if this is something should be on a podcast or not, but
that's why we do this.
Anyway, one of the selectmen, they call me, like a town councilor, said to me, "You're the first pastor this town has ever had. There wasn't a story going about him regarding some woman in town." Oh. I said, "Well, I understand that." I said, "They saw my car in every yard. They couldn't pin any one woman on me."
Oh boy! Yikes! So when you think about, you roll your decades of ministry in the local church, probably many highs and lows and wins and losses and
for sure.
learnings and
for sure
all those things. A question I wanted to ask you is, if you stop and you zoom out on the decade scope of it, what things have brought you the most joy in ministry? What's been the thing that you're like, since day one, the preaching first time, what's been the consistent stuff? There's like, this is why all that's worth it.
Well, just the entrepreneurial side of me, and maybe that would be not even the ministry side in some ways, is to see things go forward,
right?
To see certain goals,
to create and develop,
and certain, even in buildings and all that. But that's all secondary. That's a means to an end. I think probably one of my highest values is what I see as being in harmony with God's value when He sent Jesus to die on a cross. And it is to see people transformed by the power of the gospel. Mm-hmm. And that was just forever our emphasis. We were not there for ourselves. We were not there to consume it upon ourselves, whatever teaching or friendship or fellowship or whatever was going on. We were only there to be getting prepared to fulfill God's purpose, right, by sending Jesus to the cross. And so seeing people's lives transformed and valuing that every which way we knew how to value it,
right,
and to value the people that had a part in it and helping those people come to that decision. And especially valuing baptisms and rejoicing in that point in their lives.
It's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah,
it doesn't get old when you really take it seriously.
Oh boy, you just hit something, Brent, I want to speak to. New can even get old.
Yes.
After a while.
Yeah.
You can be as innovative as you want to be, and it gets old.
Yeah.
But one thing that never gets old is seeing transformed lives.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And I remember we went to Disney World many years ago, just my wife and I was just overwhelmed. I couldn't believe there could be a place like this. With the money we spent, wasn't much for what we got, I felt like. Yeah. And we went back a second time, and man, it didn't nearly seem to be nearly as much as it was the first time. Well, it's because the first time it was new.
Factor,
you see? Well, then the next time we took the kids. And the kids were all ears and eyeballs and all excited and just going crazy. Well, all of a sudden it was newer than ever was before.
Right.
Just seeing their excitement.
Yeah.
And when you see the excitement of changed lives and the difference that makes in their lifestyle and everything else and the miracles that are performed as a result of that, I'm telling you, that keeps things new.
It sure does.
And exciting and alive.
Yeah.
And so.
And that's good. It's encouraging for me to hear because that's one of the things that even, I've been at this for about 15 years and, there are ups and downs for sure. And yet that, man, and sometimes you have to stop and look and like hear a story and really let it register that, wow, they really did find life. And that, man, that's so motivating.
And smell the coffee on that, smell the roses about that and rejoice in it, and celebrate it and let the people celebrate it.
How did you do that? Because one of the challenges, you grew Moncton Wesleyan, from hundreds to well over 1,000 people, and you start seeing these larger numbers and sometimes you have to really fight to make that one matter and like
Yeah.
to get that story. What were some of the
Well,
ways that you
I
stayed
think
connected to people?
What we tried to do is publicly value every aspect of what brought a person to Christ and value that transformation and just highlight the joy of all of that and even the joy of whoever had a part in it. Because you see, one of the things that I'm concerned about in ministry, we can preach seeing people come to Christ, but if we're not having a part in it ourselves,
Right.
it can get to be resented.
Yes.
Us talking about not doing anything about it. And so
Right.
people have got to see illustrations
Yeah.
here of people we have been leading to Christ
Yeah.
ourselves and helping in that journey.
Yes.
So I never put it on people, a guilt trip about you're not witnessing or you're not soul winning the way you should be. Here's what I tried to teach and preach, that every one of us can have some part and should have some, and should be intentional about it and have a conscience about it that's with us day and night as to how we can have some part in seeing somebody come to know the Lord.
Yeah.
Not be the one to lead them necessarily, but at least we have some part in that process.
What kept your kind of tank full on, like anybody who knows you or has met you or maybe sat under your ministry, especially when you were the senior pastor at Moncton Wesleyan, one of the constant testimonies was, he led this big church, but he really he knew all our names, and you really have a gift for making people feel valued, and that comes from a genuine place where I actually think you genuinely value people. And what's kind of gone into developing that muscle?
Well, that's a great question, man. I'm glad you asked me that question because that's of high value to me.
Right.
So it's a question.
I admire that about you because I don't. It's not a natural thing for me. I'm fairly introverted actually, and so to see you, you remember people's names. You always make people feel so.
If you're telling the truth, you're the person to be asking me this question because I'll tell you what, I was more introverted than anybody you can think of. And I had to just determine as an act of my will, as a decision, to be deliberate and intentional and disciplined to do that.
Right.
And so I made it a habit to, and especially when the church was small, then this became, of course, something that was ongoing. And it was in a day, you wouldn't believe the psychology, not the psychology, but the culture of that day. That's the word I want, the culture of that day. You're supposed to go in the church, never open your mouth, because you're supposed to be quiet when
Solemn.
you're in the house of the Lord.
Right.
Right. And so when I started going up and down the aisles and greeting people, loving on people, I was as awkward as a fish out of water. It just wasn't me, but I knew it was necessary because of people, the need of people. Everybody needs to feel valued.
Yeah.
Everybody's coming from some degree of inferiority about something.
Yeah.
And so my word, hell broke loose there for a while because this was just disrupting everything for anybody to be doing the likes of that in the house of the Lord.
Right.
You know. And so but it became eventually something that became almost who I was. Mm-hmm. But I had to force it. It had to become a habit. Yeah. And there's great power in patterns and habits.
Right.
And there were times I would go into that place and maybe some devastating thing. I remember one time, a terrible devastating thing kept me up all night the night before. And I remember not wanting to talk to anybody. I'll just go to my office, preach what I have to do, and then go back to the office afterwards. And then all once when I went into that church, I remembered that scripture verse, give and it shall be given unto you. It doesn't say give if you got it.
Right.
It says give it anyway.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel like giving anything, but I just determined I'm going to give it.
Right.
And so I went around doing what I always did. And whether it was God or the state I was in or a combination of both, the affirmation that came back to me was overwhelming that morning. And I went to that pulpit, preached like a house of fire, and went out and did the same thing after it was over with. And what I take the initiative. Some people are scared to do it because there's people that's got a pet peeve they want to talk to you about, and that takes away from your focus in preaching. Well, I didn't hardly allow that. I would talk to them about something good and positive. How's the cat? How's the dog? Or whatever I could think of, Yeah. And then we'd get pictures of all the people, especially after Facebook.
Yeah.
that I met once I got their names, and I go into the church early Sunday morning, memorize those names. Yeah. Oh, I got to tell you one. You'll love this. We've got a person who's a crackerjack on staff, just came on staff in our church now.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. She was in the corporate world. She was overseeing 300 employees in the corporate world, and she is just on fire. She went to 3 of the most prominent churches in our city, came to our church, then they came back a second time. This is just after I went back to the church, after I pastored there for 44 years. And I was back there a second time for a few months. And I called them by name. And when she told me, just this the other day, she said, when you walked away, my husband looked at me and said, we're home.
Wow. You knew their name. And yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
It is.
And so here's my premise. If people can feel welcomed and valued, it doesn't have to be me, but just I got to set the example, though. I feel that's my conviction. Welcomed, and it'll rub off on them too, just because of my example. Welcomed and valued. Then, when they go into that service, they won't see the negatives nearly as much. They'll see all the positives. Well, now, if they go into a cold place, they'll see all the negatives and no positives, even though it's the very same kind of service.
Well, you think about there's that. And you've probably used this maybe in consulting before, where you go into an old kind of podunk church that's, maybe hasn't changed anything. You're like, you're nose blind you're too familiar with your surroundings. You don't see it for what it is. But there's a flip side to that, and that is, if you can get somebody to feel like this is home, there is a positive in the fact that they don't see the flaws the same way that they would otherwise.
That's right. Listen, I got to tell you this. Now that I'm doing what I'm doing consultations and so on, wherever I'm asked to do a consultation, I go in incognito ahead of time.
Okay. Do you put a disguise on, like a mustache?
In some places, maybe I should. But anyway, just to observe how they do things.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you this. If I go to a place where they don't know me, nobody speaks to me.
Wow.
Now, here's the crazy part of it. When I sit down to do the consultation, one of the questions we ask, what's the greatest thing about this church? Oh, the people are so friendly.
Yes.
You see, now, if they are friendly, it's damaging, because being consumed with each other makes the other person that's coming new feel rejected.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And but there's a reason for this, Brent. It's uncomfortable for everybody.
Yes.
To go up to a stranger. There's nobody that's a total comfort zone.
Yeah.
It might be a politician or somebody that's used to doing it, but other than that. So people revert back to what's comfortable, even if they may get started down that road a little bit.
Yeah.
And that doesn't cut it.
So let me leap off that and even go back to something you were talking about a second ago that I think is I find it inspiring, and I find it really important for the times we live in. You talked about how, use that example of you had something pretty traumatic happen. You still had to go and, perform at some level. You had to preach. You had to value people.
I had to fake it, really.
You had to fake it. And I want you to speak to that, because we live in a time now that, frankly, I think idolizes feelings.
Mm-hmm.
That's in the air of our culture today. Is like, if I don't feel like it, I'm not being true to myself. I gotta go with how I feel, and people are really led by their feelings. And frankly, they would say, "Well, that's being fake. You're not being true to yourself. You're out there." And the older I get, and then when I admire leaders like yourself, I'm like, I don't call that fake. I call that faith. Like you're being faithful.
I say, the saying is, "Fake it until you make it." I say, "Faith it until you make it."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Speak to that.
Well, I will.
Though,
look, you are asking the best questions you could be asking me, imaginable. But let's just. Here's what I believe. The worst fuel on which to run the spiritual motor is a fuel of inspiration. Now, let me explain.
Yeah.
I love inspiration more than any other person on the face of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
I love listening to inspirational messages, inspirational motivational talks, reading inspirational material. I love inspiration.
Yep.
But here's the problem. If we're depending upon inspiration to keep us going, to keep that motor running, the minute a little bit of rejection comes our way, it totally evaporates.
Yeah.
So what is the fuel? I'll tell you what the fuel is. It's the same kind of fuel that Nehemiah had when he said, what God put in my heart to do, And he had to build those walls, and everybody was fighting him on the outside, on the inside. And he says, with conviction and commitment, he said, we will arise and we will build. I'll tell you what, there's no inspiration to that. No feeling wanting to do it. It was because God put in his heart to do it. And I'm telling you, there's a lot of things that should be in our hearts to do that we don't have God telling us what to do. It's just we ought to know this is what we should be doing.
And I've felt to a new degree over the last maybe 5 or 6 months, I've had to discover what faithfulness looks like in a different way. For instance, I don't get the same maybe high that I used to get every Sunday preaching to all these faces and getting that instant feedback, and having those dialogues to God about I didn't call you to ride the high of how that makes you feel. I called you to serve my church, and that's whether they're watching online or they're shut down or what. And I find you so inspiring on it's not fake, it's commitment, it's faith, it's faithfulness.
It is priority of conviction over personal comfort. Right.
That sounds like Jesus. That sounds like how he. I think of Philippians 2, right? Like consider how he.
I believe in transparency to a degree.
Yep.
And we have to
authenticity, right?
Yes, authenticity.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Being totally authentic and being open and all that. And I've heard you in some of your sermons share some stuff that's pretty raw stuff. But I don't know that we just have to be acting like we're totally wiped out and discouraged and all this. We've got to faith it until we make it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think you probably could speak. You've been in leadership and ministry and working with people long enough to probably see one extreme to the other, and you might have come through a time where people weren't honest enough about what they were going on behind the scenes.
That is very true, Brent.
Yeah, but I feel like we've kicked it fully the other way, and we've begun to idolize, depression and anxiety and all these things. They're very real, and I'm not saying they're not real, but I think we hold them up with such esteem that we got to bow down to them like their Lord and Savior.
See, I guess what I'd like to drive home is it is the power of a commitment that can overcome those bad feelings because of the results that come from that kind of determination and commitment like Nehemiah had, that the wall got built. And I know you go on and read that whole chapter, the celebration that there was.
Yeah.
You're not going to celebrate if you don't stick to it.
That's the thing. And I think that's the thing we miss. You become a slave to your feelings, and then you miss actually what ends up being, frankly, a more powerful feeling on the other side of commitment.
Oh, man. You got it.
Yeah.
You got it.
So when you think back on your ministry, we talked a little bit about what's brought you joy. You aren't a proud man. I've found you to be very humble. But when you think back of what, in the best sense of the term, proud, what are some of the things that you're most proud of over your ministry? Like as far as between you and the Lord, even if you'd be willing to share some of that. There's probably the obvious stuff that you've accomplished, but when it's all said and done and you're done, Moncton Wesleyan and the Buckingham Leadership Institute, and God calls you on to heaven someday, and you get to reminisce, you think about, that really, there's the obvious thing over here, but that thing I'm pretty proud of.
Well, I'm not sure of the answer, but let me respond, and that might be the real answer. My calling, as you heard me say earlier in this podcast, was so strong I couldn't get away from it, even though I didn't feel worthy or capable. I really didn't feel capable at all. Oh my goodness. And so, but one of the things that has been my greatest concern in ministry, as it relates to Atlantic Canada, because that's where I was born and brought up, was the desperate situation in Atlantic Canada in the church.
Yeah.
Now, it's not only in the church, it's in business as well. We have this inferiority feeling that can happen everywhere else, but it can't happen here.
Right.
And I have felt, ever since I started the ministry, the back of that has to get broken.
Yes.
And I got to do my part. And that's one of the reasons, not the main reason, but one of the reasons I stayed in Moncton for 45 years pastoring that church is because I wanted to dispel this lack of believability which meant breaking all the barriers that we had in front of us. Keep breaking barriers until I was done, so I couldn't be breaking those barriers anymore. Because different barriers at different levels and all that. And maybe, in fact, I'll give you this illustration. I had my peers preaching. I preached all over North America and conferences and so on, and they would say, why would you stay in Podunk, Moncton, off the face of the earth there, off the side of the earth, where if you jump off, you're gone, no people, and so on and so on. And they said, if you preached in a certain city, you could have 10,000 people. Okay, maybe I'd only have 100, but let's just assume that I might have had 10,000 people.
Yeah.
My belief was, if I can get this job done here, and the ripple effect can create some believability in churches that have bought into that negative thinking it can happen here, they won't be able to think that way any longer. Yeah. And so they'll be forced to think maybe it can happen here. Mm-hmm. And hearing from pastors that have bought into that, like yourself, and believe that, and see them go further and do better as you have done than we were doing, that is my greatest satisfaction, to know that ripple effect is going to maybe mean tens of thousands of people someday in heaven that wouldn't have got there if we had not said, we will arise and we will build.
Yeah, I love that answer, Dr. B, and I would just affirm you, like that's what's spoken most to me, watching your ministry, and I'm a follower in that. I've had the same conversations with leaders, around North America, and even
you have
in the UK, and
more so than I would have
made connects and had doors of opportunity open to me, and I just feel very back to conviction and calling. I'm born and raised here. I love this part of the world, and I want to see God's kingdom really overcome a lot of the things that I think have locked up Atlantic Canada.
And what you're doing, Brent, what you're doing now is going to have a mighty impact in Atlantic Canada, but because of other factors, new technology, all the rest, it's going to have a mighty impact throughout North America.
Yeah, and it's been cool to see God expand that, but it's been interesting, Dr. B, over the last maybe year and a half, that God has increased my burden. Even as our platforms expanded, we have, I've signed over, the last 7 or 8 months, I've signed, first time giving. We send a note to someone who starts giving and contributing. And I've signed some from the United States and Alberta and BC and all that. And that's great. It's really cool.
Yep.
But God has increased my burden and desire really for Atlantic Canada. This is the mission field He's called me to.
Brent, got to stop you. This is COVID.
Yep.
But I got to shake your hand. I'm telling you what.
A social distance handshake.
You don't know what that music is to my ears.
Folks, if you have a complaint, you can email that to
me.
To dan.lamus@kingschurch.cc.
But really and truly.
Peter.moore@Atlantic
There you go. Listen, nothing you could say would thrill me more than what you just said. Because it's going to be carrying on what has been such a deep, deep, deep conviction of mine that I've never been able to get away from. Even though in my worst days in Moncton, when we're going through unbelievable pushback and opposition, I was getting invitations to some of the greatest places that you could ever imagine, double the salary and twice the 3 times the size city. But I had to say, God wants me here. And what I've come to conclusion is, we can get more diverted from God's will by the opportunities that come our way.
It's a good word.
Than the obstacles that we have to face.
Yep.
And I've often said, if it weren't for pastors moving all the time, U-Haul would go out of business.
Yeah, you're probably right. I think you're totally right on that. God can, and this is for anybody that's listening that's maybe not in ministry. I do think that sometimes the enemy can actually distract us with a great opportunity.
Really and truly.
It's not a God opportunity.
And we're the worst among as pastors. We can rationalize,
totally.
I think this is
God
God's will.
Any old church
because we just don't want to face the music of what needs to get resolved.
Yeah.
And so if somebody else comes in and has to deal with the same issue, it never gets resolved. They move on and they go on to some other place where nobody's got things resolved. Once you get the things resolved that need to be resolved, you don't go back there again.
That's right. Well, one of the things to that point that you've inspired me a lot, and as I think about modeling my life in ministry, I do think about it over the long haul, and maybe in different circumstances and scenarios we came into leading a church, but you got to lead Moncton Wesleyan for 45 years. And if my health stays, and again, I would never presume to know what's going to happen. We get talking about decades, but I do have an opportunity to have some real longevity and to see what we could accomplish
Amen.
over the long haul. Yep. If you speak to longevity, how did you kind of stay at it and stay committed? And
I can't believe you're asking me the questions you're asking me, because it's just the ones I love to answer.
Good. Well, I need your answer.
Well, no, you don't need it, but others may. When I went to Moncton, I read a book by Elmer Towns. It was about the 10 largest churches in North America, and the book said they'd been there for an average of 25 years. I thought, 25 years?
Wow.
How could anybody stay
average?
Average. How could anybody stay in a place for 25 years? That's just crazy.
And that was in a time of more pastoral transition than now.
Yeah. And then I end up being in a place for 45 years. Well, anyway, but here's what I have discovered. If you have a long-range view, you will do things you would never do if you knew you're going to be there for a short time.
Wow.
Now, some people would say, oh, but you should anyway. Yeah, maybe you should, but you won't.
Right.
You may as well face reality. Right. You will not want to be bothered with it but things that need desperately to be addressed that build a foundation for going on to the next level.
Right.
And so that's no wonder there's so many small churches. There's not been a foundation through the difficult decisions and difficult conversations. Yeah. And let me throw this in too. I believe one of the greatest lacks of leaders is the unwillingness to have the difficult and critical conversations with influencers.
Right.
And we expect too much of our people, because we're into this day and night. You and I just hear this stuff all the time.
Thinking about
read it.
Dreaming it.
We're listening to podcasts. We're just our dear people, they get a little bit of it on Sunday, maybe in some other places, and they don't get exposed to that stuff. And we've taken 1,000 steps to get from where we once were to where we now are in our thinking. And we expect our dear people to take those 1,000 steps in one gigantic step.
Right.
They can't do it, nor could we have done it.
Right.
And so that's the reason that we have to sometimes sit down, have a compassionate, respectful, understanding, seeking first to understand, ask questions, and help people to understand where we're going, why we're going there, all the factors that are important. But I'm telling you, I even heard Patrick Lencioni say in a recent podcast that some of the greatest businessmen won't have the difficult conversations that they ought to have.
Right.
They avoid it and want somebody else to do it. And we got to listen, Jesus went to a cross for us.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't
dealt with the problem head on.
I haven't had to go to a cross yet.
Yeah.
There's no conversation that's going to be that difficult.
Yeah. You're right.
And 95% of them, if we do it right, will work.
Yeah.
There may be 5%, or so,
sideways,
no matter what you do, they're not going to be satisfied.
Yeah.
But here's what the tendency is, Brent, is to see other people who look like that 5% as people there's no sense of bothering with them.
Right.
When a little bit of investment.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the influencers.
Yeah.
1 in the 15 people are influencers, they say.
Yeah.
Look for the influence. That's a judgment call sometimes. They could be official. They could be unofficial. Mm-hmm. But we need to have the conversations with those people.
And if you have a short-term view on your calling and your role at the church, you're not going to be motivated to deal with difficult things.
Absolutely.
But it's kind of like, the home I live in right now. If I'm planning to live there for 20 years, which I am, so this is the home that we want to bring our kids up in.
Yep.
I need to deal with if I have an issue in the wall or that kind of thing, because it's gonna come back to bite me. But if I'm just gonna move and leave, then who cares?
Exactly.
And that's a great word there. It's that.
Well, it does something for your determination, and does something for your incentive. It does something for your creativity, because to know that long range you're going to reap the benefits of it.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with expecting that and enjoying that possibility.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, to have the reward of faithfulness.
Absolutely.
Is much greater than the kind of the flash in the pan reward that you get. I remember I asked a mentor of mine one time, the guy in the States, just, world-class leader, but not a household name. It's kind of one of the best kept secrets in, the U.S. sort of thing. And I said, why have you not been on the, the high ticket conference speaking?
Right.
Why have you kind of kept a pretty low profile? And he said, I did a little bit of that at first, and I found it was cheap. That it was kind of like babysitting. You roll in, you're the hero for a night. You let the kids stay up late and eat chips, but I don't have to deal with real life. And he said, I want real life, and he said, I want to deal with the real reward of like family and growing together.
I know you haven't got time for stories.
No, I want them.
But W.A. Criswell was one of my heroes, and he's pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas for 50 years, and it became the largest Baptist church in the world under his leadership, and so on and so on. Well, anyway, I called him one time, and he called me back, and I wanted to come to Moncton for a conference. And of course, we're talking this Texan way of talking. He said, "Now, my dear brother," he said, "I am the pastor of a church." He said, "When you're the pastor of a church, you can't be gallivanting all over the country."
Yes, sir.
He said, "Now I won't always be the pastor of this church." And he said, "When I'm no longer the pastor, you give me a call and I'll come and be with you."
Yeah, that's that just it rings something in my heart though, because it's not that you say no to every opportunity or that kind of thing, but it's like I'm called to this church. I'm called to this family. I'm called to my family, my kids, and that it's because I've said yes to that.
Exactly. But as a pastor, and you're doing the same thing, Brent, as a pastor, W.A. Criswell became maybe the greatest influencer in the Southern Baptist denomination of 16 million people.
Right.
This is half as many people as are in Canada.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, now I think a lot of them weren't actually alive, probably.
Possibly so.
There's rumor on their
Somebody told me there's more Baptists in Alabama than there are people.
Yes, that's I've heard that too. How have you dealt with? Let me ask you this. I mean, the hard part about longevity and the hard part about growth, especially growing a church or growing an organization, is it comes with. When you're the Nehemiah and you're the tip of the spear, it comes with a lot of criticism. It comes with a lot of flack and having the patience and the grit to be able to help people make that journey from step 1 to 1,000. It just takes its toll on a person. How have you dealt with criticism?
Well, I've not always dealt with it well, especially in my days when I was somewhat insecure, maybe to a great degree insecure. But there came a point where I had to cross a line, and I went by a verse of Scripture, and I'm not saying this is a cure-all and end-all, but the verse of Scripture, love never fails. And so I determined whoever I was having difficulty with, if they were an influencer, that I would have a conversation. And we're going to work, and I would I've spent as much as, over a period of a month or two, 16 hours with one person until there was a breakthrough.
Wow.
I've been up in my office till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning until there was a breakthrough, helping develop trust and understanding and help people to see where we're coming from. It's understandable that they don't understand.
Right.
And if you can see it that way, then it motivates you a little more to try to develop understanding and help them to, because they sometimes it's just suspicion of their own issues or who knows what. Yeah. But it's on me to develop the trust.
Well, you said the word, insecurity. You can deal with criticism from a place of security, but you couldn't have those long conversations with somebody if you were insecure. So what's the secret? What's the secret to personal security and leadership beyond just Jesus? Like how do you apply your salvation and your faith in such a way that it gives you real groundedness and security?
I think just to say about Jesus, I can't get away from that being in what we're in, but some others would call it being principle-centered. I call it being Christ-centered.
Good.
But what I mean by being Christ-centered, I don't think most people have 2 clues what it means to be Christ-centered.
Yeah.
And my idea of being Christ-centered is being like Jesus in the way he functioned with people. And Jesus was always motivated to add value to other people's lives.
Yeah. That's
what he was always trying to do. So here's what he would do. He was never concerned, however he got there, about people affirming him.
Right.
He
didn't need that.
No. Well, he may need it. I don't know. Being a man, as much man as you've never been God, as much God as you've never been man. But he refused to be concerned about that, and he was always, what can I do to make that other person feel the best that they can feel about them,
right?
Rather than having other people make me feel the best about,
right?
And I just had to come to a point where that is not even going to be on the radar.
Right.
How other people are making me feel about me.
Right.
It's all going to be on the radar of how I can make other people feel about them.
Yes.
Well, then it comes back to you.
Right.
You can't stop it. I hear people about pastors not getting affirmation. I got more affirmation than I ever deserved.
Yes.
It was beyond reason.
Yeah.
But it was because I was continually, deliberately, and intentionally, in every which way I could. I'd even write it down in my daytimer. Encourage everybody today by so. It doesn't cost a thing.
Yeah.
Doesn't cost a thing. And what that has done to bring people alive and to help them feel the best about themselves and it set me free.
Right.
Now there's other factors, but you've got to live a holy life.
Yeah.
You can't be undermining your security by knowing you're living one way and trying to make other people feel you're living a different way.
Yeah, you've got to be receiving that fundamentally.
So those
from
are
the
two
Lord.
very fundamental parts of it. But then the affirmation comes, it builds your confidence. There's a lot of things like that. But I would say moving from, here's the reason that I feel, Brent, a lot of people are not the encouragers they should be. Mm-hmm. They are so insecure, they're just needing that for themselves.
Right.
So they don't even think about encouraging somebody else.
Right.
They think about the encouragement they need, and somebody else ought to be encouraging them.
Yeah.
Well, there came a point with me, I just refused to have that on the radar about how somebody else should be encouraging me. Not even allow myself to even go there, not let my mind go there. How can I be an encouragement to someone else?
Yeah.
Well, then it started coming back to me. I can't stop it. I mean,
given it will be given to you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's it.
Does
that make sense to you?
It totally does. I mean, it's a fight. It's something that I think somewhat like every leader has to grow in.
Well, it's deliberate. You got to be deliberate and intentional, and you got to be focused and find. Listen, here's another thing. I don't think anything ever gets accomplished without accountability. Either I've got to be able to hold myself accountable, which there's probably very few that are able to do that, maybe 5-10% at the most.
Yeah.
Or somebody, I got to find a way to be held accountable for whatever. And so there's a discipline and accountability that has to come to keep this on the rails.
Yeah, yeah. There's a saying we're using around here a little bit when some of our kind of higher level leaders, talking about this very thing about security and being a self-differentiated leader that absorbs stress, not makes people more stressed. But the language we're using is, you can't need who you lead. In that, I can't come to someone that I'm leading and come to them needing something from them. I have to be depositing something for them.
That's right.
And
You're so right.
It just undermines the whole thing otherwise. But
it does. And having the conversations were so rewarding. And I had to have some awful hard conversations for all the time. I was there all the time. I was pastoring some difficult conversations in many ways. But almost got to be, I was so sure the outcome was going to be good that it didn't have to dread them, even though it was not always. There was always a little bit of concern, I guess. I wouldn't say fear, but concern.
Yeah, yeah. So a couple more questions, and you're so easy to talk to, so we could probably stay here all afternoon. But I know, we'll get this on. But I wanted to ask you about change, and you have one of the things with longevity and having put multiple decades in. You've seen a lot of things change, specifically in the church. Some things have changed for the better, and maybe there's some things you're like, I don't know if that's a good thing or not. What would you say are some of the things that you've seen as you've become an elder statesman in the church? What are some positive changes you've seen begin to happen? What are some things you're like, I think we should revisit that?
Well, I'm glad to hear you ask that too. I think that the church where it's being done right is far better off than it's ever been. Whereas, like this church, for example, and the leadership you're giving and the results of that leadership, we never had anything like that. when I first started. There was not a large church in Atlantic Canada, maybe one. Other than that, there were no others that were of any consequence. And so to see the change of churches, some churches growing and going forward like never before.
A lot of them now, too, right?
Really,
It's not
quite a
just
bunch,
us. There's a bunch of
comparatively.
really-
Now there's more decline than ever before, which
Yes.
is a sad thing,
Yes.
too. But doesn't have to be, and hopefully we
Yeah.
can all have a part in helping this. And what I'm doing right now
Yes.
gives me an opportunity to be more direct in helping
That's
to see
right.
that come to pass. And so that has been a great thing, really. And I think because of people like you, and even what I'm trying to do is to help people highly value the importance of change and reinvention and speaking the language of today's culture in a way that they're going to hear without compromising with the culture.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of creativity. It takes a lot of imagination. It takes a lot of debate and discussions. But it's being done in places where they're deliberate about it.
Yeah.
And this is one of those places right here.
Yeah. What you have wisdom, and what are some things that you're like, I'm not so sure that's a good trend. Whether it's holiness or like are there things in the church you're like, as I see, my generation kind of start to take the helm, are there some cautions you'd give us?
I would say some lifestyle caution concerns,
Like what?
No,
that's
all right.
Want it.
That's all right. That's good.
This is gold. This is gold to me.
Well, we know the big issue of the day, same-sex marriage and all those kinds of things.
So like
and you hardly dare to say a word about it because people think you've got some kind of hate. Listen, let me say the other side of that. Mm-hmm. The position I took in the church, we're going to be as accepting of the worst sinner imaginable as we are of the greatest saint imaginable. They're not going to be treated any differently as far as acceptance.
Right.
That does not necessarily mean approval.
Yeah.
Now, so our love for them is going to be just as great as love for anybody else. It really is, and it was.
Yeah.
But that does not mean approval.
Yeah.
So if there's something disapproved, people who are trying to live a different lifestyle that's not approved by the Bible and for good reasons that God knows and I think most of us realize, then that cannot be interpreted as rejection.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and that speaks to the value of. I do think my generation probably is going to have a real test in: are we going to stand with biblical authority, or are we going to let it go? And you see a lot of churches kind of letting it go.
The tragedy is, for the most part, where it's being let go, those churches are dying.
That's the thing. I know. I remember this. Well, we already lost the people that are offended at this point anyway from your last comment. So I'll say this because they're gone. But I was out driving with my family, and there was a church that had a big rainbow flag on it, and my son goes, there's a rainbow flag on that church, and I go, yep, and I go, and I said, I just made a comment, and I go, I don't know of one church that's growing and reaching people, where you're seeing real life transformation, the thing that you were celebrating about. I don't know one that's taken a broad theological and philosophical or even orthodox, like an unorthodox view. I don't know one that's actually seeing fruitfulness. And I do think there really is a reward of fruitfulness for those who will hold on to the word, even if it costs them something in the culture. And you look at the churches that are actually growing, they're fairly traditional in their biblical interpretation, and they're allowing the Bible to be authoritative.
Well, the other side of it is one of our, I guess, cultural developments that people heard me talk about all the time. We want this place to be a place of love, acceptance, forgiveness, healing, and encouragement, as opposed to a place of rules, regulations, judgment, suspicion, and technicalities. Yeah. Because I know the reason for the rules in some cases. I've putting the best construction on people where there is a lot of legalism is so that people be more like Jesus. Truth is, they're not even thinking about Jesus. They're just thinking about the rules, and everybody else got to do what I got to do, and we all doing what we're supposed to be doing. There's judgment, and if anybody's just But where there's a place of love, acceptance, forgiveness, healing, and encouragement, it makes you want to be like Jesus.
Yeah. You're right. I think one key, and this is something I've been thinking about, is the church really needs to rediscover the full message of the gospel, and not give it halfway. Like, I think you'll see some churches or some maybe traditions have given this, it doesn't matter who you are, what you've done, and what, like, all those things, or what you do, and all. That's very true. God is full of grace, and you see other legalistic, expressions that it's all truth and law, and it's like, actually it's the full, both of those things married together, and it's a real tragedy anytime you see a church that's just taking one side of those or the other, and you don't get the fruitfulness of, the cross is the most inclusive invitation of all time.
Amen.
Come to me, all ye who are weary. And it doesn't matter your sexuality or any of those things. But it also says, like, surrender. So it's also the most exclusive invitation of all time, too. You don't get to decide from here on out.
Yep.
And it's
But isn't it a wonderful feeling, Brent, to be able to be totally accepting of everybody, and yet realize for their sake the line has to be drawn when it comes to approval. Yeah,
and I think one thing that'll give us a little more integrity with our message is we got to get better at dealing with our own sin and our own sinfulness, and that's part of the problem, especially when you get talking about family and sexuality and all that. Is we've made lines of division, and we've made that singular thing such an issue, and so we've cut off our ability. And so I understand the people who are crying out. It's coming from a good place, the people who want to be affirming. I really believe that. I just think that it's biblically inaccurate.
Really, truly, So and I'm glad to hear you say that, because they're to be commended for that kind of a spirit.
I would call it unsanctified mercy. Like, it's like, well, it is. It's actually from a legitimate, generous heart that thinks they understand what's best. And I don't pretend to understand what's best or worst. I'm just, with these issues, at the end of the day, I've got to go with what I believe the biblical interpretation is. The moment someone comes open and, on issues of gender, sexuality, marriage, those things, the moment someone comes to me and says, here's what the Bible says, and they show me, I'll submit to, submit to whatever it says. Unfortunately, back to my thing that concerns me in this day and age is most of these conversations have been taken out of the realm of biblical interpretation and back into the realm of feelings. I feel this to be wrong, therefore, and I that's a scary thing.
It's kind of, I know this is anecdotal, but it seems like it's kind of a scary thing to think that places where things have been so liberalized, whatever that might mean, that they're going right out of business. You'd think something could be learned from that.
You would just think by looking at the data objectively that maybe we're missing something here.
I talked to a leader in a denomination that once was born in revival, that has gone the liberal route. And he was an evangelical within one of their large churches, comparatively large for them, in Toronto. And I said, what is the future of your denomination? He said, unless there is change, in 25 years, we will be extinct.
Yeah, 100%. Because the word is living, and the word is the thing that generates life and power and multiplication in the church. And when you let go of that, you're dead. It's just only a matter of time.
I don't want to labor this too much, but there's a church not far from here, I won't name it, that in the turn of the last century was born in revival.
Wow.
They had 500 people in a small town. I'll say it wasn't Sussex, but the size of Sussex, and probably a lot less back 100 years ago. 500 people came to the Lord. So they had to build this beautiful edifice in that community. 3 years ago, they tore it down.
Yeah.
And they have a congregation of about 25 people.
Wow. Yeah, I think God, though, is refining his church, and he'll let some things die. He's not afraid of pruning the bush. Let's kind of start landing the plane with that. What excites you? What excites you most about this day and age? I mean, we talked about what concerns you, what gets you fired up.
I'll tell you what excites me.
Good days ahead.
But maybe it's not I can't really think necessarily. Maybe the number one thing I might think of that after I leave here, but is people like you now. And what I mean by that, I think that some of the leaders coming on are so far ahead of us, and they should be. I mean, ahead of me. I never heard the word leadership when I first started.
Right.
That's one of the greatest needs in the church among pastors is people who will be real leaders, like we read about in the Bible.
Yeah.
That stood the test and had the creativity and the ingenuity and the innovative abilities. And I'm of course I believe the church ought to be the most dynamic creative force on the face of the earth.
Yeah.
I mean, because of who we are, God's children.
Yes.
And so to see young guys coming on, not all, but enough, or not enough, no, never enough, but some who have got that and are so far ahead of what I was when I first started.
Well,
that excites me.
The reason we're ahead is because you've paved the way
Well,
and we stand
I don't
on your
know.
shoulders. No, your ceiling is our floor, and that's because you've propped us
That's
up
great to
there.
hear.
I'm
That's
very
great to
aware
hear.
of it. I mean, that's why I wanted to sit down with you and Dr. HC and Pastor John. Like especially the deeper I get into this and the older I get, the more I value what you guys have done to pave the way. And I don't feel like we're an island to ourselves. I don't feel like we're our own success story. You are part of our success here, very much, and very much part of what's shaped me.
Well, that's very complimentary. What I want to think is that the three of us are a terrific trio, not a terrible trio.
I would agree. So tell us really quick before we sign off, what are you up to these days with Buckingham Leadership? Give us 5 minutes.
You've sure asked me the right question
what
with
you're
that.
doing.
Because of my passion and vision that existed in the 45 years that I pastored in Moncton and what I wanted to see for Atlantic Canada, now I'm able to have a direct influence in that. It was indirect before.
Yep.
Now it's direct. So that we're mentoring pastors. We have cohorts of pastors or 2-day mentoring gatherings all over Atlantic Canada. Now this is before COVID. Some of those things have had to get postponed, which is all right. With other things that we're doing during this time that needed to be done. And then we're doing church consultations, which where there is, this is another subject, but where there is a culture of trust.
Yeah.
In other words, if the people trust the leadership, I go into a declining church that's lost generation after generation after generation, and even because of my stage in life, they will take it from me as opposed to maybe taking it from a young guy just out of college.
Right.
Because they say, man, if he's saying all this stuff, he's saying the same thing that some young guy says, then I guess we should sit up and listen.
Yes.
And where there's a culture of trust, we have just seen those kind of churches just double and triple and
great.
All go forward like never, ever. But it's the most exciting thing to see that happening in a direct way. You know. Now, it doesn't happen everywhere.
No.
Because if I go into a place where there's a culture of distrust and it's systemic and it's been long-standing, then the very things I present as recommendations become controversial.
Right.
But where there's a culture of trust, they just go after that like
it's
hungry
exciting.
tigers to a piece of steak. You know?
And that keeps you energized. and
Energy! I never felt more energized in my entire life at 81 years of age.
I hope I have half of it. When I take
No, really,
your energy today.
I have to say I have more energy than I ever remember. Now, part of that is I don't have the pressures that I once had, but I'm working just as hard as I ever worked.
Really quick, speak to this because we do have some folks that would be listening to this podcast, maybe a part of King's Church, that aren't pastors, they aren't leaders, but speak to what staying engaged in something that you're passionate about. Like you're a very healthy and active person at 81 years young. Speak to encourage somebody who's listening that maybe they're just entering retirement, or how have you processed that?
Here's one thing. I'll just say a couple of things that maybe don't seem that important. I watch my diet. I walk 70,000 to 100,000 steps a week.
Wow.
And so I'm very disciplined about that. And my weight right now is the same it was when I got married.
Wow.
57 years ago.
Yeah. Does that become a challenge actually to keep weight on
challenge.
at this point?
Challenge.
Yeah.
Nobody knows. People say, oh, you're lucky. I want to slap their face. You know, I mean, there's nothing lucky about it. It's getting on the scales every day, holding myself accountable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's kind of aside. I think the thing that energizes me is purpose.
Right.
And and I've heard said, it's not all original, somewhat original, life is not about pleasure. Life is about purpose.
Yeah.
Now, here's what happened to me. When I finished, I was tired and didn't know it. So I thought, well, I probably should take it easy for a few years. Mm-hmm. Well, that lasted for a month. It seemed like a vacation. And then I just eager to get back at things again. And it took me a while to get this all sorted out. But I discovered I feel better emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, and every other way you can feel good by having purpose and pursuing that purpose.
Right.
And when I pursue a purpose that is right, that is my pleasure.
Yes, that's a good word. That's probably a good word to land the plane. Dr. B, thank you so much.
And my great pleasure.
Can I get your commitment to come in maybe after COVID's done? I don't want to get too much flack, but have you and Pastor John and
hey, that would be fun. That would be fun.
I'll just lob some questions and see you guys tackle
they probably won't be able to do much that would help you, but I could help. I could help them, and that maybe help you.
Here, so we'll make sure it keeps going straight. Thank you, sir.
Oh, this is great. Thank you.
Hey, thanks everybody. So appreciate you listening. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Dr. B as much as I did. He is just a wellspring of knowledge and motivation and inspiration, just a real gift to the kingdom, and I hope you enjoyed it. Hey, if you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe, maybe leave a positive review, maybe share this link for somebody else to enjoy the conversation and get this podcast out there to as many people as possible. We'll see you next time.